After tiling a material in xTex and reviewing all of the individual texture maps, the next thing we're going to want to do is open the material in our 3D preview. And as of xTex 2.9, we have some extra features to talk about in this 3D preview. So in this video, I am just going to cover all of those and talk about how we can actually use them to improve our experience and our final material. So the first thing that we can see when we open up the 3D preview is this cloth geometry in our default background. That's just this gray gradient. And then we have the option to save a snapshot, which is one of those new features I mentioned. So anytime you have this window open with any geometry or whatever material you have, you can choose to save a snapshot. It will open up the file manager, which allows you to choose where you actually want to save that image. And then we could then open up that image that we have. It's named after the material itself. And there we can see just a quick little image that we made. It's not going to be as nice as, say, a ray traced render, but if you just wanted to quickly create thumbnails of your materials, you can do that here using whatever geometry and whatever camera angle you want. And that will lead us into our viewer settings. So if I click the viewer settings option down here, that will open up this little tab. And we have a bunch of different options here. The first being the camera option, which allows us to choose and save camera angles that we like inside the actual scene we have here. So if I were to manually place the camera directly on top, like right above this material, I could then click the plus icon next to it to create a new camera, name it like cloth top. And then no matter where I go or whatever model I have open, I can always go back to that camera, choose cloth top, and it will always position me right back there. So if you were interested in using the save snapshot feature in order to create a thumbnail, this is the best way to make it consistent. Make sure every single image is exactly the same every single time, so that the only difference is the actual material that's open. Next, we have the geometry section. This is where we actually change the 3D model of our material. If I were to click that, you can see I already have some models loaded in. To choose a different one, you would then just click whatever model you want. It'll open that and it'll already have your material on it. If you want to add a new model, it's pretty straightforward. You can click the plus icon, just like we did before. And then you'll want to navigate to the place where you've actually downloaded that model and saved it. These models come from the customer portal. They're a specific xTex geo file. You can't just import any FBX or OBJ file. It has to be this xTex geo file. So I've actually gone to the customer portal and downloaded a couple different ones here. So if I choose the crumpled cloth scene, click open, I already have that asset in here. But if you already have the asset, you'll get that little message asking if you want to overwrite it. But if you don't, it will just load right in. It'll have our material on it. And it's pretty easy to then build up a little library of preview geometries in here so that you can see your materials in, situations that suit the material better. We also have this rotation slider under the models now. If I were to manually slide that, you can see that it rotates the model itself. And we even have a play and reset button here. So if you don't like that, if you want it to be in the orientation that it originally was in, I can click the little loop icon here and that will reset its position back to 0. And if I click the play button, it will do a nice little turntable animation. Then you can just kind of stare at it as the lighting hits it from different angles to get a better idea of how this material is going to react in your 3D software. I'll just reset that. Next, we have the environments. And this is going to be really important because the default environment does have pretty flat lighting. So if I were to click this drop down, you can see I already have a list of different environments. If this is your first time opening up the 3D preview, all you're going to have are default and studio, but we can add in more the exact same way that we added in different geometries, and the lighting of the environment, you can see it drastically changes how our 3D model is going to look. So this is very important when you're reviewing your materials to view them under different environments. But so again, if I wanted to add a new environment, all I need to do is click the plus icon and then navigate to the place where I saved this new environment. I have a home studio. If I click to open that, and then you see we have a new environment, new lighting to go along with it. And all of these that I have shown you so far, they're all included in the customer portal. They're part of your subscription. You don't have to pay anything extra for them. You can just go get them straight from the asset section of the customer portal and put them in your software today. So that looks pretty good. I like this scene that we have here. Now let's talk about these last little features. Over on the right-hand side, we have the exposure. This is going to change the levels of the lighting, the exposures of the actual image-based lighting that we have open. I can click to reset that. We have rotation again. This is actually focused on the environment though. So if I rotate that, we can see the environment changes, our lighting changes on the model, but the model stays in the same position. And then we have the new toggle rulers function, which if I click the little power button next to toggle ruler, we have these little rulers that will then pop up next to any of the 3D models that you open, just to give you a better sense of scale that we're working with for this model. So we'll see before we open up the shader settings tab, you can actually change the scale, but by default, the scale of the model and the material will be correctly based off of this ruler that we have. And last but not least, we have the toggle constant background feature, which allows you to remove that image from the background, but still maintain the image-based lighting that we have here. And then you can change that background color with the slider between black and white here. Next, we have the shader settings tab. If I click that, these are all going to be sliders that actually correlate to the texture maps themselves. So the first is the UV repeat. This is the one I mentioned. This is tied to the scale of the model itself. So I can increase the UV repeat, and you'll see that will change the scale of the model or material. It won't actually change the output from xTex. All of these other ones will transfer over to, say, your U3M file that you export, but the UV repeat will not. The texture maps will keep their correct scale. Using it here in our 3D preview just allows us to see the material repeating more on any given object to help you find bad tiling. So here, according to the sliders that are tied to the actual texture maps, the first one we have here is the normal depth. If I were to increase or decrease that, we can see the bumps on our, for the material on this model will actually become deeper or more shallow depending on how we slide it. And it can even go inverse. So I have, significant little bumps on this material. So if I were to set this to 1, those are like the default values of these bumps. If I were to increase it to 2, all the intensity of the bumps from our normal map are doubled. If I were to set it to 0, they would be pretty much perfectly flat. Next, we have the metalness slider. This material doesn't necessarily have any metalness, so this won't change it too much. But if you do have metallic bits on your material in the metalness map, this will allow you to increase or decrease their intensity. The specular slider will change the specular reflectance of the material we have, but we want to keep this at 0.5. I wouldn't ever really recommend moving this. This one should stay the same, especially when you're working with U3M PBR materials, because there is no specular map. This is just directly tied to the shader itself, and we don't need to adjust this at all. Then we have our roughness. If I were to lower that, we could see our material becomes a bit more reflective. And combining that with our bump, if I were to have my normal set all the way to pretty much 0, and then I change our reflectance, our roughness, then it becomes very smooth and like a lot more glossy looking. We have our alpha as well, which can now be toggled on or off. So I do have a kind of transparent material here. If I were to change the model back to my cloth that doesn't have any thickness, this model has some thickness to it. If I were to send it back to my flat cloth, we can see the transparency here. If I were to just toggle my alpha on or off, you see transparency turned off, transparency turned on. So you can just toggle that on or off depending on how you want to view the material when you're reviewing it after tiling it. And then we have the slider, which will make the material more or less transparent. It's a uniform change. It's not like it's making opaque bits more transparent or transparent bit less transparent. It's just making the whole thing more transparent or the whole thing more opaque. And last but not least, we have the base color, which default is set to white. You can actually click this little color icon and change that. It's just going to multiply this color onto whatever color the original map was. That's why white makes it like the original color. And then if you want to, you can change between bright and dark here. If you change it to dark, it's essentially turning the color all the way off, and you're like eliminating that map. I like to use all these sliders when I am reviewing a material because you can easily tell which map is causing a problem. If you watch our reviewing your materials video, you can learn a little bit more about that, but I can just use the process of elimination by turning certain maps all the way off. If I see a problem in my material, and then if there's only one map left, I know for a fact that it is that texture map that's causing the problem, and then I can go back into 2D and actually fix that map itself. And one thing to note about all of these sliders, like I said, except the UV repeat, they will all transfer over if your software supports the U3M file. So if you use, say, Blender, VStitcher, KeyShot, anything that directly takes the U3M file, these will transfer over. So if I had my base color and my roughness turned all the way down, and it looked like this in here, and I saved it, and then I imported this into a software that supports the U3M file, it's going to look like that in there now. So just be careful. I usually recommend setting these back to their default values, and most programs actually have a version of these sliders in there. Like these intensity sliders, you can find those in our Blender plugin, you can find them in VStitcher, you can find them in KeyShot. They're going to be just as customizable there. So don't think that you have to use these here. That just depends on your workflow. I mostly use them to find problems in my texture maps. And last but not least here, we have our advanced settings, which are new in 2.9 as well. And these are extra shader settings that come along in BSDF shaders. Not all software will support these. Some software will only support a couple of them. Some programs like Blender will support all of them. So I might as well just cover these here as well. We have a clear coat, which adds a perfectly clear, perfectly smooth coating on top of this material. And then connected to that, we have our clear coat roughness, which allows us to then still have that clear coating over the top, but have a uniform roughness value on top of it. A lot of times the materials that come straight out of our scanners, if they have a clear coat on them, the way the maps are created, the lighting kind of just penetrates straight through that clear coat, and it doesn't really affect the normal map. The normal map could still have a lot of bumps and things in it. So if you have a clear coat, it kind of smooths that material out, still allows the normal maps to cast shadows below that clear coat, but still have that perfectly smooth coating on top of it. Next, we have transmission, which is another form of transparency, but it's more how light passes through the material. An important one for people working in fashion and furniture is going to be sheen. This gives us sort of that directional lighting effect. It's going to depend on the type of material you use, but this is the type of effect you're going to see in like velvet materials. Maybe if I turn off my opacity, we can see it a bit more. But this allows, you can see it's a pretty subtle change, but when you're on a steeper angle, we're seeing the light kind of be reflected more from steeper angles than it is when I have sheen turned off. Everything is just a bit more uniform across the material. And then when we turn sheen on, we can see the darker areas get a little bit darker. That's because they're like absorbing more light as a velvet would. And on these highlights, we're seeing them actually become brighter because that's the correct angle that the light is going to be reflecting at us now. And last but not least, we have the index of refraction, IOR. And certain types of materials have different levels of index of refraction. Most fabrics and opaque materials are going to sit somewhere around here where it's not really refracting a lot of light. But if, say, you were working with a glass or a clear plastic or something, you can always change this value to, just more accurately reflect the material you are working with. Right now, you can see no matter how much I change it, I have a pretty opaque material, so it's not going to affect it that much. But if you had a clear glass or a plastic or something, that's going to be important to have as an attribute for that material. So if you're working with those types of materials, you probably have a list of what the actual IOR is for the type of material you're working with. That's pretty standard workflow for people working in industries that use those types of materials. You can find those just doing a quick Google search, index of refraction of different materials. There's like hundreds of different options for it. You know, you can find the index of refraction for different types of woods and fabrics and all of them, but when they're not actually super transparent and not refracting a lot of light, you can see once we have some transmission turned on and the light is actually coming through this material a little bit more, the IOR starts to come more into play and how this light is actually bending through this material. But for regular fabrics, you're not going to see any of that happening really. But these are just some of the advanced features we have as part of the new the new 3D rendering tool inside xTex. So I hope all of these help you guys in making your materials. And if you have any questions, definitely write into us and we can, answer anything from how to use these to what programs actually support them. Otherwise, I think that's about it for the new 3D preview we have in xTex. Thanks for watching the video and have a good day. See ya.